Throughout your life, you've probably heard the expression, it's not what's on the outside that counts, but what's on the inside. Often it's used to encourage helpful behavior and self-confidence, but I'd like to take a second to apply it to video games. Art style, graphical fidelity, and visual appeal go a long way in shaping our first impressions of a game. If something catches our eye, we're more likely to give it a shot, while conversely, games that don't appeal to our keen eyes may go ignored, even if they belong to a genre that the person adores. And of course, this will be subjective for every individual. While I've personally ignored certain games for their art style, it often isn't the most important factor to me. The looks and sounds of games can only aid or hinder a video game experience, but they can't define it in the same way that stories and mechanics can. Because of this, I'm often hesitant when tackling games whose biggest selling point or discussion topic revolves around presentation. Then, along comes this game. Kena: Bridge of Spirits utilizes a gorgeous art style to present its characters and game world with an attractive exterior, but stripping away this layer reveals a title that greatly struggles to distinguish itself mechanically and narratively beyond this well-realized appearance. The high quality of the animation may resemble some of our favorite animated films and shows, but the gameplay offered is rather rudimentary, while its narrative offers very little character exploration or engaging plot points. This might lead you to believe that I didn't enjoy this game, but paradoxically, I did. I don't think every title needs to be the latest and greatest thing to be enjoyed or praised. Kena has some decent ideas, even if they are borrowed from other titles, and if it could have executed them well, consistently, we'd be talking about one of my favorite games of this year. With how it is now though, I worry my perception of this title will dwindle, much in the way a movie can when evaluating it directly after seeing it versus a few weeks or months later. Only time will tell, but in this present moment that you, the audience, can never be a part of, I can assure you that this title was an enjoyable foray. So with that, welcome to my review of Kena: Bridge of Spirits. Kena is a somewhat open-world action-adventure game that features standard third-person melee combat that's paired up with very light exploration, puzzle, and customization elements. By far though, the most engaging part of this game is its combat, so let's start with that. Kena herself is a capable fighter who can hold her own against the forces that oppose her. At the outset, she wields only a mystical staff that's used as a melee weapon with light and heavy attacks, as well as a defensive shield used for parrying and a standard dodge roll. As the game progresses, Kena unlocks a handful of capped ranged attacks like arrows, bombs, and a dash that refills on a cooldown meter. The game consists of roughly 4 sections, and each new section rewards the player with one of these new abilities. It's a standard affair, but by the time you reach the final portions of the game, you'll have many options for disposing your foes. You'll spend the most amount of time using your staff to clobber enemies, but over time, the damage it deals becomes lesser and lesser as stronger enemies are introduced. The most impactful part of your arsenal then becomes the bow and arrow, as it can interact with enemy weaknesses to deal tons of damage, and can also be used to blow up bombs faster, creating more damage in itself. It's a handy tool that will help you clean up enemies at a distance, while also chipping away at some of the tougher bosses' health bars. Your other tactical advantage is Kena's ability to wield the Rot as weaponry. The Rot, in universe, are these tiny creatures that consume and destroy corruption. They're super cute, but within 2 seconds of first seeing one, you'll already begin to wonder just how much money they're making off the plushies of these things. After all, it can't be like an animated movie if it isn't going to have massive merchandise appeal. Anyway, in combat, their usage is also capped, but instead of refilling over time, it replenishes by collecting yellow orbs or by taking damage. You'll get a few charges to use at a time, and they can be used to stun enemies, supercharge your arrows and bombs, or access healing items throughout the arena. You can't spam these abilities, which helps ensure that every decision must be well considered before it's enacted upon. They truly can turn the tides of battle, and so they're a worthwhile inclusion to your arsenal, especially when you get access to these rot plants. These allow your rot to form into a water dragon of sorts that's capable of destroying corruption plants and enemies efficiently and effectively. And you're gonna need all the tools you can get, because Bridge of Spirits is by no means a cakewalk, unless of course you're playing on easy mode. I played the game on normal, and let me tell you, this game isn't afraid to kick your ass. And it's here where I wanted to talk about the game's biggest flaw: its various approaches to difficulty. Kenna makes combat challenges harder in one of three ways as the game progresses, and one of them is great, but the other two are artificial and cheap. Kenna's best attempts to pump the difficulty comes in the form of its sometimes excellent boss design. Somewhere on the internet, a review of this game will name drop Dark Souls simply because of the boss encounters, but you won't find that here. Instead, I'll say that many of Kenna's best encounters come in fights with bosses in one-on-one duels. These fights rely simply on the ebb and flow of combat to produce challenge, as the player must manage incoming flurries of attacks by memorizing patterns and knowing when to strike back. The challenge comes from finding and mastering the dance of combat. Some of the best bosses in the game follow this design, such as the Mask Maker, Warrior, and the Corrupted Woodsmith. These fights occasionally spawned a few additional enemies, but never enough to bog things down. But that brings us to the first of the two artificial difficulty inflators, the use of additional enemies. For every good boss fight in the game, there's one that insists on spamming lesser enemies to aid the boss's efforts. It's almost like the developers knew these bosses weren't mechanically rich enough to challenge the player on their own, and instead of developing them further, they just threw in common enemies to enhance the difficulty. Having players assess and manage threats as they arise might seem like a good idea on paper, and often it is, but when you have enemies that infinitely respawn, it's just annoying. There were a few fights like this, but none stood out as much as the Stone Guardian. He would be quite easy to handle on his own, but these common enemies keep spawning in over and over again, making your window of opportunity to deal damage to the boss smaller and smaller. It's frustrating and it feels cheap. This problem is compounded by the fact that you aren't afforded many chances to heal. Kenna can take a handful of hits depending on the size of your health bar, but most boss arenas only permit you to heal twice. There's no healing items like, I don't know, an Estus flask? Oh fuck, I guess you can add this review to that list as well. But for real though, nothing feels worse than getting hit by an enemy that you couldn't see and losing vital chunks of health in a tough fight. And I should mention that this also applies to non-boss encounters as well. There's plenty of times where the game will spawn a tougher foe, such as a mage, or one of these phasing assholes, and they will be accompanied by wave after wave of lesser foes. This is the biggest flaw of Kenna's combat, the over-reliance on mobs to create challenge. The other issue with combat pops up just enough times to be notable, and that's the game's insistence on stripping away tools and abilities that you've come to rely on. This happens in three instances. To a lesser extent in these fights versus the Hunter and the Corrupted God, as well as in the penultimate boss fight of the entire game against Toshi. In the Hunter fight, the boss is airborne, and so your melee potential is greatly reduced. He will occasionally land on the ground, but his flurry of airborne attacks will see you soaking up a lot of damage rather quickly without granting you a chance to churn out significant damage of your own. You're left there like a sitting duck, and the waiting game is never fun. And in the final fight, your rot abilities are stripped away for a brief period of time. But it's much worse in the Toshi fight, where your arrows and bombs are often reflected back at you by the boss. Perhaps this is an issue simply because I found myself relying on bombs and arrows a lot during my playthrough, but it felt annoying that my preferred style of play was stripped away for such an important fight in the game's narrative. Before we wrap this section up, I do have to make special mention of the corrupted Taro fight, because while it was another really good encounter, one small element of it was so bullshit that I can't not mention it in this review. This boss's grab move is utter garbage, as it can connect from a faraway distance with no attack animation, all in the span of a single frame. When the fight concluded, I immediately uploaded this clip to my video editor just to check it out, and as you can see, within the span of one frame, I'm locked into a grab animation from a significant distance. This happened a few times throughout this fight, and that's terrible design. I could not let it go unmentioned, as it dragged down what would have been a top 3 boss fight in the game for me. So yeah, Kenna has some really good boss fights and some really good enemy encounters, but they're scattered between too many combat encounters that are dragged down by these issues. Combat remains enjoyable, but it's these continued missteps paired with the lack of personality in the boss design that will ensure that this game's substance will fade in my memory as the days go by. A much smaller portion of this title's gameplay comes down to its exploration, but it's handled very well. The intense periods of frantic combat is perfectly counterbalanced with calm yet enriching moments of exploration. Outside of some simple map markers, the game really doesn't tell you where to go or how to get there, and instead affords that opportunity to pure player discovery. Navigating these beautiful and vast environments often meant surveying the landscape, picking out points of interest, and doing my best to reach those locations using what I knew. There's also a plentiful number of opportunities for discovering chests that contain customization items or currencies that can be used to deck out your Rot Guardians or to purchase new combat moves for Kenna. You'll also discover Rot creatures themselves, as they hide all throughout the environment, kinda like Korok seeds do in Breath of the Wild. There's also an assortment of light puzzles that Kenna will have to solve throughout the game, and I do hesitate to call them puzzles, as most of them can be solved in just one step, but sometimes determining what that one step is can trip you up momentarily. It often means locating these blue crystals throughout the stages and using your pulse ability to make them radiate to open up nearby doors. These are also used in platforming puzzles where you'll have to rotate stones to cross them before a timer expires. These are small inclusions, but the game's handoff approach to HUD elements and guidance means figuring them out for yourself can still be rewarding despite how simple they are. Finally, you'll also discover things in the world that open up more combat encounters. These cursed chests can only be looted if you complete the accompanying trial, which is often a standard fight with a twist, such as requiring you to avoid all damage or to beat a certain number of enemies before the timer expires. And then there's the Spirit Mail, which was one of my favorite inclusions in the game. These are well-concealed collectibles that unlock homes in the village. The village is your base of operations, and returning to it is meant to be comforting. Being able to rid homes of the corruption that consumes them using Spirit Mail aids in the cleansing and, by extension, the comfort of this location. It also rewards the player with plenty of loot, which is always nice. And all of these factors make exploration in Bridge of Spirits a modest but worthwhile endeavor. Alright, let's just get this over with. Yes, this game is absolutely beautiful. And yes, its animation work elicits memories of Pixar movies past. I'd argue that Pixar movies made today do look better than this game, but given all the moving parts of a game versus a movie, the efforts are still spectacular. Most of the praise will go to the development team at Ember Labs, but it must be extended to Sparks, a Vietnamese animation studio who was largely responsible for the look and feel of this title. A lot of work was put in to make this game breathtaking, and the teams were keen on taking advantage of what they had built. The game world was constantly shown off in beautiful vista shots that had me stopping just to look, more than in any other game this year. And nowhere is this invitation extended more than in the meditation sections, where you're given time to just sit and reflect on a tough boss fight while soaking up the view. Yes, this game looks beautiful, but let's move on. The soundtrack of this game fits perfect with the atmosphere, as a heavy emphasis on wind instruments comprise the bulk of the music. I did really enjoy the music found here, and the soundtrack overall was pretty top-notch. Tons of tiny audio cues are included to keep the player informed, such as to tell them when their ranged weapons have regenerated and when an arrow has been pulled back all the way to guarantee maximum damage. Really, the only sound that stood out to me as poor was the sound of Kenna's staff connecting on melee hits with enemies. To me, it sounded artificial and didn't meet my expectation for what I thought it should sound like. Unfortunately for Kenna, the player hears this sound a lot throughout the game, and it stood out as being a weak link in an otherwise strong effort. The level design in Kenna Bridge of Spirits was one of my favorite components, as exploring the snowy mountainsides, open plains, dense forests, and claustrophobic caves was always a treat. This felt like a natural landscape, not one designed for the purpose of a video game, and that greatly aided in the quality of the exploration. Going along with that is how this game handles its HUD system, as there's very little shown at any given moment. Only the most relevant information is displayed, and even it is kept to a minimum as to not take away from the landscapes and your discovery of them. In terms of technical performance, I didn't encounter many issues while playing through Kenna on my PlayStation 5. The only thing of note here was some noticeable instances where the game would stop me in my tracks to load the next part of the level. And finally, I wanted to make note of the customization, as you can purchase hats for the rot creatures using in-game currency. It's a small touch, but these beings are so core to the experience that getting to dress them up how I wanted to made for a cute and endearing touch. The weakest component of Kenna Bridge of Spirits is its narrative, as it's unable to capture the player's interest with its weak characters, baseline plot, or even its beautiful yet familiar setting. The basic plotline here is that Kenna, a spirit guide of sorts, stumbles upon an ancient village that has been engulfed by corruption. Her attempts to reach the mountain shrine is halted until she can help 3 spirits who are trapped in limbo between life and death after encountering the corruption. These 3 spirits include Taro, the older brother, Adira, the village woodsmith, and Toshi, the village leader. Each's story is told in vignette style, and while there's a general sense of what's going on, none of it is very impactful. We're only told bits and pieces about the circumstances surrounding the lives of these people, which creates some mystery. That is, until we encounter them in the final boss fight of each section. After defeating them, the game unloads each character's backstory and plot on the player, which kills any air of mystery surrounding the narrative, while also not replacing it with anything of note. They build things up with snippets, but then unload the full story in lengthy cutscenes, and to me, these two approaches don't gel cohesively. These stories and characters never really captured my interest, and the drawn-out cutscenes often had me zoning out. We're told early in the game that Kenna has a personal reason for trying to reach the mountain shrine, and I was hoping this would lead somewhere of interest. Instead, it's just a minute plot point to add on top of all the others. Meanwhile, we don't share nearly enough time with any of the other characters to get a true sense of their personalities. They are all just cookie-cutter people with generic personalities. Good stories include a combination of character growth, moments of tension, engaging plot developments, and/or fascinating personalities, and Kenna simply doesn't have any of these components. Much like the spirits within the game, my experience with Kenna will fade away. Years from now, it'll occupy an incredibly small portion of my long-term memory, and may only be recalled when mentioned by name or while watching a Pixar movie. Still, I have confidence that if, and when I recount my time with this game, it'll bring a brief moment of joy. The combat and exploration were both good enough as a whole to keep me invested in playing for the roughly 8 hours it took to complete the experience. While the story failed to captivate me in any way, shape, or form, the beautiful environments and sense of exploration stood out as strengths for this title. And despite some issues with design, the combat remained challenging and enjoyable throughout the experience. I can't say I'd recommend this game for $40, but if you can pick it up for $30 or less, it's well worth your time. Kena Bridge of Spirits is truly one of those games that's here for a good time, but not for a long time. Thanks for watching. Hey everyone, that brings us to the end of this review for Kena Bridge of Spirits. If you enjoyed the video, consider checking out some of my other reviews on the channel, and if you've played this game, let me know your thoughts on it in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more, follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp, and as always, have a nice day, and take care.